Welcome to the 23rd episode of How to ThinkScript. In this tutorial, we're going to be writing some very simple and basic ThinkScript code to answer one of the more commonly asked questions in trading, and that's which moving average crossover is best. Now, today's tutorial is going to be very beginner friendly, so if you've never written a line of ThinkScript code, or maybe you're newer to ThinkScripting, then you will be able to follow along, and the download is in the description links below. If you'd like to follow along, you can use the link in the description box below. Scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page where you can download the final version of the Backtester that will build in today's tutorial. All right, now let's get started with the actual ThinkScript portion of this tutorial. The first thing we need to do is define our ThinkScript goals here. Now, the best way I know how to define this is by using a real example of a question we'd like the Backtester to help us answer. So one question may be, hey, is the 8-period exponential moving average crossing above the 21-period exponential moving average generally a good strategy on, let's say, something like the S&P 500? That's to say, is that a good time to enter the trade when we have this crossover in the bullish direction, and then we get out whenever we have the crossing over in the bearish direction? That's to say, the 8 crosses below the 21. So that may be a very real scenario that you'd like to test out. Now, let's say you have the results of this. Maybe that crossover happens 4 times with a P&L of, let's say, 5,000 bucks. Now you'd like to see what happens if you change this 21 period right here to, say, a 34. Does that 5,000 increase, meaning going to something like, let's say, 6,000 or 7,000, meaning it's a more profitable strategy? Or instead, does that P&L get worse and maybe go down to something like, say, 2,500, which tells you that, hey, the 8 and the 21 is better than the 8 and the 34? Now, by powers of deduction, you can obviously test a series of moving averages to get an idea of if you'd like faster moving averages on certain stocks, if you'd like slower moving averages, if perhaps, let's say, the 8-period exponential crossing over the 50-period simple is a better crossover on your favorite tickers, so on and so forth. So our goal is to help build a backtester here, which not only answers this question, but also makes it efficient to test different hypotheses here. So when I say that, one thing that you may want to change is this 8 period. You may want to change that 8 length to any other number you'd like to test out, right? So that's something that you as the user would like to be able to control, and that's the reason why that's going to be an input variable. Now let's keep moving forward in our question here. The next thing you'd like to be able to control is the type of moving average. So here we have exponential, but instead you may want to test simple, Hull, Wilder's, or weighted moving averages to see if that improves or decreases your profitability. Now you may want to also test the crosses above versus crosses below for bearish trades. And then similarly, in the second slower moving average, you also have the same two variables that you'd like to change, which are the slow moving average length, which is the 21 that we see right here, along with the slow moving average type, which is this exponential right here. Now, all of the different things here with a rectangle behind them are going to be what we consider input variables. That's something that the user can control directly from the studies menu, which is this screen right here in your chart. So whenever you load in an indicator, you double click it, you're taken to the studies menu right here, which you'll notice you as the user, instead of needing to go inside of the code to change any of this, can directly set the fast moving average length right here. So you'll see that set to 8. The slow moving average length set to currently 21, the fast moving average type currently set to exponential, the slow moving average type currently set to exponential, based off of this question we're looking to answer. Now you can also change the crosses above and below. Above in this menu right here, you'll notice this is currently a screenshot from the final version of the one we'll build. Now let's see what the strategy actually looks like plotted out on our charts. So that's the same 8 crossing above the 21, and if we see a screenshot of that, here's a final version on the S&P 500 using a daily time frame chart. So here you should notice, first off, we have the 8 EMA crossing above the 21 EMA. These labels are automatic, which is something that we'll build as part of this tutorial. Then coming down here, you'll notice we have the 8, which is the cyan line, crossing above the pink line right here. And this is the crossover moment, and the strategy then enters the trade at this pink arrow right down here, and we're using the close for the strategy. Now the strategy exits whenever the blue line, which is the 8 EMA, crosses below the pink line, which is the 21 period EMA. Right? And so this is the exit point for the trade, and this P&L right here is what's factoring into the green histogram bars right down below, which is the actual floating P&L of this very strategy. So you'll notice here, if we take a look at all the entries, we have one entry right here which closed out. We then had another entry which opened once we had the moving averages cross up in the bullish direction, which closed out when we had the moving averages cross back below. We had another trade which opened right here. This was a loser when the moving averages crossed back below. And overall, you'll see the P&L really just tracks over time. So you get an idea, so far the trade is bullish, the strategy is bullish, and then we come down. we had our loss, so the P&L here dips a bit, and we currently have an open trade right here, which so far is looking like it's a winner, at least trending in the bullish direction so far. Right, and so this is the final version of the strategy. And now let's say you wanted to test the 34. You could very easily come back into the studies menu, change this 21 to a 34, and these P&L histogram bars right down below would update real time. So a quick summary of the concepts that you'll learn prior to us going to the coding portion. So one thing, which I've already touched on, is the idea of input versus def variables. Def variables are the ones that users can't control. Input variables are the ones that user will be able to control. And you'll also get an idea of how setting something like the input variable becomes really powerful for something like using those labels, which are powered based off of the user inputs. Then the second concept is going to be the different types of moving averages we have, along with this idea of the average type. This is a variable built inside of ThinkOrSwim. You'll see that each moving average has a value associated with it, an integer value. So say the simple moving average is actually equal to 0 in ThinkOrSwim, which is the little trick that we can use for the variables. And then finally, the third concept, which will be throughout the entire tutorial, is this idea of what a ThinkOrSwim study is, which is our normal indicator files that we've built in most of our other tutorials, versus the strategy piece, which is what we're going to build in this tutorial here, which allows us to do things like backtest. All right, so let's get started with writing some code and shift over to ThinkOrSwim. All right, so let's get started here by creating some new code. I'll start by clicking the studies icon here, switch over to the strategies tab, and then click create. Make sure you're on the strategies tab, and one easy check is to make sure you have this AddOrder code inside. Now here I can start by giving this a new name, so I'll call this TI moving average crossover. And then inside, I'll leave this AddOrder code for the time being and create some spaces. Now the first and very easy way that we can start off is by defining our input variables. So we had input fast moving average length, and so we can set that equal to the 8. We'll then define the slow as well, so slow moving average length. This was equal to the 21. Now we also had the average type, so we'll say average type fast, and here we'll say average type dot exponential. The average type is something that ThinkOrSwim gives you as default as part of ThinkScript, and then this has a few values that you can assign to it. So if I click OK here, you'll notice this automatically turns into a dropdown, which has the following values: simple, exponential, weighted, Wilders, and Hull. Now the one other thing that I'd like to point out here is each of these values also has an integer associated with it. What do I mean by that? If I plot this out as, say, an add label, click yes, we plot out just the output of our input variable right here, and then we can set this to say color.yellow, close this out, and then click OK and apply. You'll notice in the top left-hand corner, I now have a label which currently says 1. Right? And that's set to 1 because the average type exponential moving average has an integer value associated of 1. So that means it's equal to 1. If I change this to simple, you'll notice this changes to 0. So simple average type, or average type.simple, is also equal to 0. Now if I change this to weighted, you'll notice this changes to 2. Now if I change this from weighted to Wilders, you'll notice it goes up to 3. And then if I go up from Wilders to Hull, you'll notice it goes up to 4. And that's to say each of these average types, simple is 0, exponential is 1, weighted is 2, Wilders is 3, and Hull is 4. And that value naming system there is what's going to be useful when we write our actual labels, which allows you to then take this user input and print that out in the form of text. Now here we also need the slow moving average type, so I'll say slow average type dot exponential. Now I think we have the input variables that we need to get started. So let's now start by defining the actual moving average. Now this is going to be a def variable instead of an input variable, since if I try to do something like input fast MA, and then we use the moving average function, again a ThinkScript function here, and we type in something like average type fast, then this takes 3 parameters. The first is the average type, the second is the price you want to do it on, and then the third is the actual length of the moving average. So I'll say fast MA length. Then you'll notice this gives you an error which says invalid statement input. Now if I change this from an input to a def, this should compile, and that's because this type of a function right here where you call the moving average and you set that equal to a value needs to be equal to a def variable, or alternatively a plot variable here, where if I change this to a plot, click OK and apply, you'll notice this actually creates a line on my chart. If I change this back to a def here, click apply, OK, apply, you'll notice that line goes away. And so that hopefully gives you an idea of the three different variable types. I think the three most commonly used variable types in ThinkScript, which is input, which is something that the user inputs. Then you have a defining variable, which is def, which creates this actual moving average but doesn't show it on your charts. And then you have the plot variable, which actually shows us on your charts. Now we'd like the plot variable here since we'd like to see this moving average just so we can visually confirm that this is doing what we expect. Now we also need to create the slow moving average here. So we'll say slow moving average, moving average, this time average type slow, close, slow, MA length, and then we can close this out. Now if I click apply here, what we should see on our charts is the 8 period exponential and the 21 period exponential, or 8 period hull and the 21 period exponential. If I change this back to exponential, you'll notice the blue line right here updates. So if I click apply, that updated. And just like that, you can very easily see both of these plots based off of the moving average that you've created in the input section. Now we need to define our entry conditions here. So for example, we have our buy and sell entry conditions, and that may be something like the moving average crossing above and the moving average crossing below. So for that, we can just create, say, two new Boolean conditions up here, which may be something like long entries, yes, and then input short entries, and this will be set to no as a default. Ideally, you're testing only one crossover, right? So say the moving average crossing over or the moving average crossing below for bearish trades, not both at the same time most often. Now that we have our moving averages defined, we have our input variables defined, now we need to define the actual crossover, which we can do inside of our AddOrder code. Now, a quick preface on the AddOrder code. The way it works is if I comment this out, so you say AddOrder. First one is the order type. So here it's order type dot buy to open, right? And similarly here you have buy to open, buy to close, sell to open, sell to close, and then you also have buy auto and sell auto. And so the one we'll be using is buy to open, sell to close, and then sell to open for the bearish side and buy to close. Then the next variable here, if you comma separate this, is the Boolean condition that needs to be true for the entry to actually trigger. And so for us, that Boolean condition would be something like fast MA crosses above slow MA, right? So that's to say our fast moving average here has crossed above the slow moving average. If that has happened, take the entry at the closing price of that candle and take it for, let's say, a default quantity of 100 shares. Now, this becomes useful if you're using something like futures where you may want to change this to 1. And so we can also create a quantity variable. That may be something like the last one, since we most likely are least likely to change this often. It's just a default value. And then if I uncomment this out here, this should hopefully compile. So now we have this being our add order condition, which says add order and enter this order. So that's create a buy to open order anytime the fast moving average crosses above the slow moving average. And if that happens, if this is true, then enter at the close for 100 shares in this case of the S&P 500. Now, if I comment out the second piece of code right here, we click OK. Let's see what happened so far. That takes only the entry since we have no exit condition defined, and that's saying based off of the last time we've had that condition, your current P&L would be $9,080 on the S&P 500. Now, if we come back in, scroll all the way. Now, let's say you would like to add in a closing condition here, so we'll say add order, order type. This time we'd like to sell to close. And our closing order, we said, is whenever these moving averages cross in the opposite direction. So that's to say the fast MA crosses below the slow MA. If that happens, get out at the close for 100% of my position. Now, if I click apply here, click OK, you notice the P&L here dropped. We also have more trades here. So we have our first trade, which entered. Then we have our that trade which lasted all the way until the moving averages crossed below. Then you have the second trade that entered right here. You have that trade which crossed below. Then you have the third trade that entered right here, which then you'll notice crossed below. So one thing that stands off right off the bat is if you just entered at that first moving average crossover and you never got out, that was obviously a better scenario here than having multiple trades, which also led you to incurring one loss right here as part of the strategy. So that's one thing that I thought was interesting to point out when building this, but let's keep moving forward here. Now, if we come back in, The next thing we'd also like to add in is one other Boolean condition here, which takes into account our long entries variable. So that way, if we have long entry selected as yes, then we know we're looking at crossing above. We can similarly write code for the cell condition and add the short entries as a Boolean condition there. And that then allows us to separate crossing above versus crossing below as part of two things that the user can control. So here I'll say something like long entries and fast moving average crosses above it. And then if we create the cell conditions as well, so I'll say AddOrder, order type, cell to open. This time we'd like short entries and fast MA crosses, below slow MA, then get out or get in at the close for the default 100 shares, then AddOrder, order type dot by to close, and this time we can just say fast MA crosses. This is the reverse, so above the slow MA, close 100, and then the one thing that I probably should have done is replace all of these 100s with the quantity, so let me paste that in. And now let's click apply and OK. Now, in case you don't already see these green histogram bars right down here below with the P&L, the way to turn them on is by clicking Global Strategy Settings. Once you click that, inside, make sure Display Floating P&L Study with Strategies is turned on, and that should be it in terms of all you need to see the P&L. Now click OK. That will add the floating P&L study here, where that gives you an ability to get a very visual representation of if this strategy works or not. So using the 8 and the 21 EMA crossover off of the 1-year daily time frame chart, we see our P&L here is 5662, and this includes open P&L with the trade that we've most recently opened right here. Now let's see what happens if we test this with the 34 right here. So I've changed this already to the 34. Let's click OK, apply. That 5662 dropped to 5353, and the labels here you'll see also give you that we're now testing the 8 and the 34 EMA crossover. So to answer that initial question, so far on the S&P, the 21 period has been a better exponential period moving average to be using, at least so far this year. Now what happens if we expand this from 1 year to something like, let's say, 5 years? We click apply. Here we see 5 years using the 8 and the 34. The number to beat is 10322. Let's come in. Let's change this from 8 or the 34 back to a 21 here. 10322 is the number to beat. Click apply. You'll see this number went up to 11741. So far, consistently, the 21 period exponential moving average has been a better means of helping you enter trades along with exit trades if you were looking at only the moving averages crossing over, in this case, the exponential. Now what happens if we say change this from an exponential to a simple moving average? So here our number is currently 11741. Let's see what happens. That goes up to 11772, so a little bit better. So that's a good sign so far. And now if we come in, let's say you wanted to test this out against the Wilders as well. So we know the number to beat is 11772. Change this to Wilders. That number drops substantially. So you know that so far the simple moving average on the S&P 500 off of a daily time frame chart going back 5 years has been better than at least using the 34 exponential. And if we test this with the 34 simple as well, click apply, 34 simple as well drops down. So far you know that the 821 simple moving averages are a nice combination on the S&P 500. You can also start to test this on intraday timeframes if you'd like. So you can come into something like, let's say, a 5-minute, 5-day chart here, repeat the same test. So far you see the red histogram bars give you this notion that this is not a good idea on the S&P 500 on a 5-minute, 5-day chart, or at least using the past 5 days worth of data with the current crossover conditions that we have coded in. And like this, you can come back to that daily time frame chart, and let's say instead of the S&P you wanted to test the Qs, just put in the Qs, and you have everything else update in terms of the strategy, the P&L, the moving averages that you're testing. All of that stays the same, allowing you to actually run these experiments and get a feel for some of the markets that you tend to trade the most. All right, so let's do a quick review of all that we've built in this tutorial. So if I come back into the code here at the top, we have our long and short entry Boolean conditions, which we plug into the AddOrder code, letting us control crossing above versus crossing below. We have the fast moving average length, the slow moving average length, along with the ability to change each average moving type. Then we also had our quantity defined here with the moving averages plotted so you can actually see them on your chart. Finally, we had the labels, which allows you to know exactly what you're testing without needing to continuously be on the studies menu or go back into the code and take a look to see what your conditions currently are. And then finally, we have the add order code right down here below, which is, I think, the key differentiator and the piece that makes this a bit more powerful than leaving this as a pure indicator, which, say, just tells you what moving averages are crossing over. It takes that one step further and tells you how effective that moving average crossover really is. All right, and that brings us to the end of this tutorial. Again, in case you'd like to download the final version of this code or you have some errors along the way, you can do so directly using the link in the description box and click this black button. Hope you found this tutorial useful for all of the beginners out there. I think this was a nice, gentle introduction into the ThinkScript strategy piece, and you can now start to take this code one step further, change different things, start to experiment by adding in new exit criteria, entry criteria, based off of the infinite number of conditions that you may be looking at. All right, take care, everyone, and happy trading.